So our program tonight is the history of the Southwest Cemetery. And our program is going to be presented in two different parts. I'm going to give the first part of the program, which will be an overview of the history of the cemetery, as well as some historical context about Eudora's black community. And then the second part of our program will be delivered via Zoom by Grace Aubrey, and she is going to provide information about the exciting research that has recently taken place at the Southwest Cemetery. So obviously, Eudora was first established in 1857 by German immigrants, and the overwhelming majority of Eudora's original settlers obviously were born in Germany. And one of the very first sites they established was the cemetery. The cemetery we now call the Southwest Cemetery, which is established in around 1858, which we believe makes it the oldest cemetery in Eudora. So this cemetery was originally known as the City of Eudora Cemetery. It was the cemetery that was used for the white Protestant burials of the Eudora community when it was first established. And obviously it's located quite far from the city center. It's probably over a mile away from the city center, so it's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Today, it's in the 1500 block of Cedar Street. In 1867, the city of Eudora purchased new land east of town on 7th Street, which is the modern City of Eudora Cemetery. And this new cemetery was designated Eudora City Cemetery. In essence, the Southwest Cemetery lost its status as the city cemetery. The newest cemetery established on 7th Street became the main cemetery in Eudora, and the cemetery designated for white Protestant burials. And what we now call the Southwest Cemetery was the black cemetery and or a pauper cemetery. So in essence, the city segregated its cemeteries in 1867. The city continued to own the Southwest Cemetery even after the segregation occurred. Dozens of white people received burials at the Southwest Cemetery. And we know that because there are people who are buried in the current City of Eudora Cemetery who died before 1867, died in the early 1860s. So presumably they were buried at the Southwest Cemetery, their bodies were dug up, and they were brought to the new current cemetery. We also have of the records we have of the Southwest Cemetery, only black people are buried there according to the records. So clearly white people were buried there at one point. But I think it's safe to say a lot of them were moved to the new city cemetery. Why were Eudora cemeteries segregated in 1867? The answer is that a large number of former slaves from Missouri started to move into the Eudora area after the Civil War concluded in 1865. Obviously, the concept of an integrated cemetery was somewhat radical in 1867. Therefore, considering the racial attitudes of the time, it is not at all surprising that the two city cemeteries in Eudora were segregated. Eudora is a very unusual community when compared to other small Midwestern communities of the 19th century in one key way. Eudora had a large black population. In 1870, about 25% of the Eudora Township was black, which is a very large number compared to most other towns this size. But almost all of the early black residents in Eudora were recently freed slaves from Missouri. And of course, when most black people were freed from slavery, they didn't have much in terms of money or material possessions. So as a result, virtually no black Eudora residents owned land. And if you look at the property ownership map of the township from 1873 and 1887 and 1902, this proves that pretty much 100% of land in the township was owned by white families. Since black residents could not afford land, most worked as tenant farmers or sharecroppers. This made it hard for many black families to secure generational wealth. Other common occupants for early Eudora black residents were laborers, housemaids, miners, and carpenters. In some ways, Eudora at the time was an integrated community. All Eudora schools were integrated from their inception. In other ways, Eudora in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was a segregated community. Eudora churches were segregated, and of course, cemeteries were segregated. There is abundant evidence that a branch of the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, was active in Eudora in the 1920s. The KKK in Eudora harassed Eudora's large black and Catholic communities. A collection of Eudora newspaper articles from 1924, pretty much 100 years ago exactly, they were from September 1924, written by the Eudora newspaper editor Will Stadler, who was Catholic, detail and condemn the Klan's activities in Eudora. And this photo is in our collection. On the back of it says, KKK Parade Float, CPA Picnic, 1924. I can't confirm or deny that. That's what the picture says. We know that the Klan was active in Eudora. This could very well have been a parade float. in that year's CPA picnic. Eudora's black community at the turn of the 20th century was large enough to support 3 black churches. Over the course of the 20th century, Eudora's black community gradually declined. Starting in the 1920s, black Americans residing in rural communities across the United States started to move to larger northern cities in order to escape discrimination and to secure better job opportunities. The process of rural black Americans moving to larger northern cities in the 20th century is known as the Great Migration. Eudora's black community started to decline at the time of the Great Migration. Eudora's last black church stopped operating in the 1970s. It's the one on the left. That was on Locust Street. The one on the right, that building is still there. It's a residence today at 610 Church Street. It was a black church in the early 20th century. The church on the other church has been bulldozed, I think, in 1987. So it's no longer there. In the 2020 census, less than 1% of the population of Eudora was black, the city of Eudora. Today, most prominent reminder of Eudora's once large black community is, of course, the Southwest Cemetery, which is why it's so important to us and why it's so important to us to preserve it. Several years ago, this tombstone, which formerly marked the grave of Isabel Johnson, was donated to the Historical Society by Dr. Kenneth Holliday. This tombstone was found on Dr. Holliday's property, which is located just east of the cemetery. This tombstone was almost certainly from the Southwest Cemetery. However, how it ended up on Dr. Holliday's property isn't clear. I've been told that around 1990, a bulldozer was hired to clear brush away at the Southwest Cemetery. Therefore, it's possible that this tombstone was scooped up in the bulldozer and pushed into Dr. Holliday's property. But that's just speculation. Regardless, it ended up on his property. Shortly after Dr. Holliday donated this tombstone, I started to research as much as I could about Isabel Johnson. Isabel Johnson was the daughter of Henry and Martha Johnson. Both were black. Henry was born in Virginia around 1815. Martha was also born in Virginia around 1840. Virginia was obviously a slave state. However, it's not a given that they were slaves. I haven't found evidence one way or the other. So it's quite possible, quite likely they were born into slavery, but I don't know for sure. At any rate, they both moved to the Eudora Township around 1860. So therefore, they were freed slaves at that point. Obviously, Kansas didn't permit slavery. So this was before the end of the Civil War, when they first moved here. And Isabel Johnson was their first child. Henry and Martha went on to have another 14 children together. They lived and farmed, likely tenant farmers, in the rural Eudora Township. Isabel died in 1861 at the age of 7. We don't know how she died, but it was not uncommon, obviously, for children to die at a very high rate back then. Even though Isabel died in 1861, the land for her grave was not purchased until 1866 by her parents, according to the City of Eudora Cemetery records, which we have and I've seen and looked in it. Child graves in Eudora cemeteries cost $2. It's possible that when Isabel died, the parents didn't have enough money to purchase a grave and had to work and save enough money for 5 years in order to purchase her burial spot. Just a theory. Most of the Johnson children survived into adulthood. Henry died in 1880. Martha died in 1908. Both died in Eudora. Martha Johnson is buried in the City of Eudora Cemetery on 7th Street. So we know that the cemeteries in Eudora were at least partially integrated by 1908. The Isabel Johnson's tombstone was cleaned by tombstone cleaner experts several years ago, thanks to Stephanie Jones, who's here tonight. Stephanie brought the Isabel Johnson tombstone to a tombstone cleaning conference in Lawrence, and you can see the before and after results. So it's quite an amazing job they did, and we're very grateful for that. The last burial at the Southwest Cemetery appears to have been in 1980. The Southwest Cemetery was formerly referred to by locals as the Colored Cemetery. In 1984, our organization, the Eudora Area Historical Society, petitioned the City of Eudora to rename the cemetery. And our efforts were successful as the cemetery officially became the Southwest Cemetery in 1984. Over the past several decades, the city has maintained the Southwest Cemetery. However, it's still been a largely obscure, forgotten part of our history, which is why in recent years our organization has tried to make it more visible part of our community. And that really started about 5 years ago. And a lot of that visibility was thanks to Stephanie Jones. She was on the board at the time. She really sought to increase that cemetery's visibility and advocated for it, which was very needed. Unfortunately, very few records of the Southwest Cemetery exist, and only a small number of headstones exist at the cemetery. Therefore, if we were to find out more information about the cemetery, new measures would have to be pursued. Thankfully, we partnered with KU staff who offered to perform ground-penetrating radar at the entire cemetery site. This ground-penetrating radar at the Southwest Cemetery was led by KU staff members Grace Aubrey and Blair Schneider. Blaise and Greer, along with volunteers, performed ground-penetrating radar at the entire cemetery in 2023. The results of that scan and more information about the cemetery will soon be shared by Grace via Zoom. Grace has worked very closely with us at trying to preserve the history of this cemetery. Grace and Douglas County Heritage Conservation Council member Amy Vanderwright created a new small exhibit at our museum about the Southwest Cemetery and its preservation efforts. This new exhibit, which you see there, is now on display at our museum. Just yesterday it went up, so be sure to check that out when you come in to our museum. And there's a couple of 3D printed tombstones from the Southwest Cemetery there, which is pretty neat. And of course the Isabel Johnson tombstone is there as well. We still plan to install informational signage at the Southwest Cemetery about the history of the cemetery itself. So that is going to be funded with a grant that the city of Eudora secured from the Douglas County Heritage Conservation Council. So that's really, that concludes my part of the program. And I'm now going to introduce our main speaker for the night. Grace Aubrey is a historic preservation specialist who focuses on archaeology. Grace got her BA in anthropology and religious studies from the University of Kansas. She worked as an archival intern for the Religion in Kansas project, where she learned much about the religious history of African Americans in Kansas. After earning her undergraduate degree, Grace returned to the University of Kansas and received an MA in Museum Studies and a graduate certificate in Historic Preservation. The presentation that she's about to deliver tonight is the result of her Museum Studies final product, which combines the research methodology of archaeology with the educational opportunities museums have to offer. So I'm going to go pull Grace up on Zoom so she can deliver her part of the program. Hi, Grace. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Perfect.
All right, floor is yours.
All right. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I am currently in Des Moines, Iowa, because I travel for work. So, as Ben mentioned, Southwest Cemetery was founded in the 1850s and served as the primary burial ground for Eudora. When the Civil War ended and the freedmen and women migrated to Kansas, Eudora's African American population grew. By the 1860s, white families decided to open a new cemetery closer to their churches on the east side of town. They disinterred their deceased relatives and reinterred them in the new location, effectively leaving African American individuals at Southwest. Like Ben mentioned, the African American population in Eudora began to grow until the 1920s and reached a peak at 25% of the total Eudora population. Southwest stopped accepting burials in the 1980s and ever since then has received minimal maintenance. Today, the African American population of Eudora is less than 1%. My project aims to revitalize this neglected African American cemetery, to reconstruct a once thriving community, and to tell their stories in a way that resonates with a wide audience, while incorporating both historical and scientific narratives. So cemeteries are often places of reflection. They evoke questions about the lives once lived, the memories lost, and how those legacies continue to shape our present. Southwest Cemetery is no exception. Yet, despite the curiosity it might ignite among cemetery tourists, there's a significant lack of detail about those who might be buried there. The cemetery, as it currently stands, provides visitors with no historical perspective, and there is no indication that it is an African American cemetery. With fewer than 20 surviving headstones, many of which are damaged or unmarked, gaining historical knowledge poses a challenge. Their stories deserve to be told. Storytelling has the power to evoke deep emotions. As part of historic preservation efforts, I have installed an educational exhibit at the Eudora Community Museum, which is now open. This exhibit aims to raise awareness about the importance of African American cemeteries and their stories. Museum storytelling about cemeteries uses the unique setting of burial grounds to share and interpret the stories of individuals and communities. It recognizes cemeteries as repositories of personal and collective histories, providing a tangible connection to the past. One aspect of storytelling appears on the gravestones. Each gravestone offers clues about a person's life and the historical context in which they lived. Reflection on inscriptions can invoke a richer narrative about universal themes of mortality and legacy. This is particularly valuable in African American cemeteries, where some of the stories and legacies have been lost or never written down. The purpose of my efforts at Southwest is to lay a foundation for preserving a lost community in Eudora, Kansas, which was situated near the border between a slave and a free state in the 19th century. By beginning the reconstruction and restoration of the African American past, the Eudora Community Museum can provide more resources for researchers and genealogists. Preservation efforts can also engage the community and foster interest in its local history. The project outcomes range from a general overview of the cemetery and the museum exhibit to an in-depth online account of those interred at Southwest, which is still under construction. Community engagement, access to public history, and successful storytelling are vital parts of this historic preservation effort. Now let's delve into the history of African American cemeteries. These spaces are deeply tied to themes of spirituality, life, death, and memory. The generational memory of enslavement is still vivid, and in my research I approach these topics with sensitivity, recognizing that such discussions are not hindrances, but essential to understanding the importance of site preservation. The treatment of the dead often reflects the treatment of the living. In states with a history of enslavement, burial grounds represented freedom during African diasporas. Enslaved people buried their deceased according to African traditions, practices that evolved across the southern United States. These traditions taught that the spiritual realm mirrored the physical realm, and it was the living's responsibility to meet the spirit's needs to avoid repercussions. This connection between life, death, and the burial rite is crucial to understanding the cultural significance of cemeteries. The belief in the living dead is prominent in African spirituality. The spirit of the departed can influence the living and even inhabit descendants. Proper treatment of the deceased is in the interest of both the living and the dead. The spiritual connection is familiar across religious traditions and highlights the cultural significance of cemeteries. Traditional burial practices in African American cemeteries differed from formal landscaping seen in white cemeteries. Many graves were left unmarked or without inscriptions or with handmade inscriptions. As the 20th century progressed, more elaborate markers became prevalent in both white and African American cemeteries. The landscape of Southwest aligns with these shifting burial practices. Headstones became more uniform and elaborate over time. Southwest represents a late stage of the African diaspora. It exists in a unique time, primarily after the freedom of enslaved people, but before the regulation of segregation. Eudora was never legally segregated, but white families chose to segregate in churches. Many of the first interments at Southwest were individuals freed from enslavement or were only a generation or two removed from an enslaved person. Kansas is known as the Free State, but the segregation and neglect of Southwest subverts these stereotypes about the so-called Free State and highlights the work that remains to be done. To tell these stories effectively, we must start with the meaningful research. Unfortunately, no map of Southwest Cemetery has been located, and burial numbers found in funeral records do not form any patterns. Therefore, I utilized some alternative cemetery research methods to outline the stories of those interred at Southwest. My methodology started with headstone analysis and obituary analysis. Headstone analysis involved documenting the remaining headstones at Southwest. Although limited, headstones can provide valuable primary source information. Systematic data collection included photographing, recording names and dates, and noting aesthetic details. This information helps update genealogical resources like Find a Grave. I'm sorry that my pictures are not loading. I don't know why. Well, I do know why, it's the Wi-Fi. The obituary analysis supplements headstone data, especially when headstones are missing or unmarked. By examining historical newspaper clippings and using online resources, we were able to reestablish some names and families interred at Southwest. In the 1980s, a survey was done that recorded 39 known burials, both marked and unmarked. I was able to find 68 names associated with Southwest by looking at obituaries. Okay, so here are the names of the people that we were able to find. They're listed in no particular order. You can see the legend I have in the lower left corner about the ones that were marked in the 1980s and the ones that have headstones. And you can see all the new names that we were able to find using obituary analysis. But unfortunately, headstone and obituary analysis could only get me so far. I had no way of knowing if I was missing anyone or who may not have had a headstone or an obituary. I also had no way of knowing exactly where unmarked burials were, so I had to turn to a more scientific method of finding out information about Southwest. Can you go to the next slide?
I'm there. Can you see when I do that, or?
Yeah, I have the Facebook Live pulled up.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
So geophysical methods allow us to explore the cemetery without disturbing the burials. Techniques like frequency domain electromagnetics and ground penetrating radar, which I'll refer to as GPR, have successfully identified potential burials at other cemeteries. So I knew it would help me immensely at Southwest. I am part of the Forensic and Archaeological Subsurface Target, or FAST, team at the Kansas Geological Survey, which gave me access to geophysical tools and expertise. In May and June 2023, a group of volunteers helped me collect data over 4,500 square meters at Southwest, revealing subsurface anomalies associated with known and potential burials. We divided the cemetery into 5 grids that were 30 meters by 30 meters each. Please note that there is a tree in grid 3 because that will be important later. You can go to the next slide. So as previously mentioned, I chose to employ 2 geophysical methods, frequency domain electromagnetics, and GPR. Frequency domain electromagnetics is useful in cemetery research for locating and mapping potential burials by analyzing the electromagnetic field response of buried objects to a transmitted electromagnetic signal. If you didn't understand it, that's okay. I wouldn't either. In other words, it helps detect anomalies in the electromagnetic field of the subsurface. The method involves transmitting a low-frequency electromagnetic signal into the ground and measuring the electromagnetic response of the subsurface. Buried objects such as caskets, vaults, or other metallic objects have different electromagnetic response than the surrounding soil, which allows them to be detected. For this research, we collected data at 5 different frequencies, which provided an estimated depth of investigation range at about 0.5 meter below the surface, which is about 1.5 feet. Data were collected using the continuous sampling interval. For GPR, it works by emitting a high-frequency electromagnetic pulse into the ground, which then reflects back from any subsurface object or interface that has a contrast in electrical properties. The reflected signals are detected by a receiver and recorded, and the data can then be processed and analyzed to create an image of the subsurface. The depth of penetration and resolution of GPR can vary depending on the frequency of the radar waves used and the electrical conductivity of the subsurface materials. Lower frequencies can reach greater depths, but cannot resolve smaller features. If the electrical conductivity of the subsurface soils is high, it will absorb the GPR signal before it can return to the transmitter. To accommodate for these limitations, we used a Malo Pro X GPR with a frequency of 200 megahertz. Both FDEM and GPR data was collected every 25 centimeters, which is about 9.84 inches, in a north-south direction. So the data collection was very dense. You can go to the next slide. So the FDEM results were inconclusive, probably due to telephone wires over the cemetery and activity from K10. So you can go to the next slide. We are relying exclusively on GPR results, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But to better understand whether the GPR was able to successfully image burials, I started by looking at data where there are markers or headstones at the surface for comparison. By doing this, anomalies could be aligned with headstones, thereby providing an indication of the types of anomalies associated with headstones, as well as the average depth of burial. The thinking there is that if there's an anomaly associated with a headstone, it's probably a burial. And so if we can determine what that burial looks like across all types of headstones, then we can determine what unmarked anomalies would look like. Looking at the subsurface of a marked headstone, I can see the potential burial begins at approximately 5 nanoseconds and continues to approximately 15 nanoseconds, which corresponds to approximately 30 to 60 centimeters or 12 to 24 inches below the surface. Although the subsoil in grid 3 has probably been affected by tree roots, there are several clear anomalies that occur in this time and depth interval that are associated with marked headstones. In addition to surface markers, the cemetery also exhibits another potential surface indicator of a burial: circular depressions. Based on funeral and burial records, many individuals were interred in shroud or pine coffins that would have degraded quickly. Subsurface anomalies associated with depressions are all at similar depths to anomalies associated with headstones, indicating that they are likely burials. You can go to the next slide. So when we look at the GPR data holistically, I can see some patterns emerge. Areas in blue represent low amplitude values, indicating that there are no changes in the subsurface, meaning the soil has not been disturbed and there are likely no burials there. Areas in green to yellow color represent increased amplitude values, indicating there are changes in the subsurface. These changes could be attributed to various factors, such as burials, tree roots, buried markers, or stones. It is expected that areas where trees are growing will have higher amplitude to account for the roots and other natural subsurface objects, such as stones. This is important to note because there is a large tree at the center of grid 3, which makes it more difficult to determine what is a burial and what is a tree root. Fortunately for us, grid 3 is the most well marked above the surface, which helps resolve some of these uncertainties. The results also indicate a need for further research to fully comprehend the cemetery's history and its impact on the community. And you can go to the next slide. When I overlaid the headstone data in ArcGIS, a pattern in the headstones began to emerge. There are 3 apparent rows of headstones, with the middle row being disturbed by the tree. And apparently, my ArcGIS image is not loading. That's okay. You'll just have to believe me. We determined that the tree grew around another headstone, and it has caused significant disturbance to that object. Although the middle row of headstones appears to have been disturbed, there was some order to the burials. Although that may seem logical, a map of the cemetery has yet to be found, and most of the known burials have no plot number. The ArcGIS data also shows that the cemetery may have been originally oriented to the slightly to the northwest. And if you're curious about this, this image is in my exhibit, so you can see it at the Community Museum. You can go to the next image. Okay, so finally, let's discuss the broader context of Southwest. Ben already did a great introduction to the history of African Americans in Eudora, so now I kind of want to integrate a little bit of context for the 2 different cemeteries in Eudora. Since Eudora was too small to be legally segregated, there is still no doubt that segregation played a role in Southwest formation. However, I do believe that other factors, such as socioeconomic circumstances and family traditions, also influence its use. There are records of African American families buying plots of the Eudora City Cemetery around the turn of the 20th century, roughly 40 years after the mass disinterment event. However, by the 1920s, funeral records indicate that only about 33% of Americans who died in Eudora were buried in Southwest. There are no records indicating the exact reason African American families would have chosen Southwest over Eudora City Cemetery during the early 20th century. However, finances may have been a factor. Funeral records indicate that African American families with jobs in the city were more often buried in the Eudora City Cemetery, while day laborers and families with lower paying jobs were more often buried in Southwest Cemetery. Financial constraints likely led African American families to choose Southwest over the Eudora City Cemetery. After a certain point, it can be inferred that family traditions and community ties played a role in burial decisions, with families choosing to be buried with their ancestors, no matter the financial implications. The presence of prominent African American families in both cemeteries reflects the complex social dynamics at the time. You can go to the next slide. So now let's talk a little bit about the future of the cemetery. There are still a lot of plans with this cemetery. In late 2022, I believe, or maybe early 2023, I received an initial $3,500 grant from the Douglas County Heritage Conservation Council. Since then, I have also received $4,000 from the NAACP from the Untold Stories Project, which is a project that is also funded by HCC, which is trying to tell the story of African American burials in Douglas County. So we have a total of $7,500 going towards this cemetery. We have already used a good amount of that money by resetting the headstones. Carl Ramberg has reset the headstones at Southwest, so if you go out there now, they all look nice and pretty. I also plan to clean the headstones with D2 biological cleaner. I just have to put in an order for that. And we are also going to put a sign at the cemetery. We're going to put 2 signs up. One that says the names of all of the people who are buried there, or at least all the names that we could find, and one that will serve as a marker for the unmarked burials, kind of thinking along the lines of the grave of the unmarked soldier, just to kind of give them something physical to connect them to the cemetery. And you can go to the next slide, which is just questions.
I'll turn on the lights and get you back onto the main screen, so. Put the zoom back up.
Could you read the names of the people in the cemetery that you have?
The names.
Or is there a handout or a place where you can see who they are?
Did you hear that, Grace?
No, can you repeat it?
Did you repeat the question? Remember?
Oh, the names of the people that you found at the cemetery.
She wants to know if there's a list of the names of the people found at the cemetery.
Slide 8.
There will be, when we get the signs ordered, that's what one of the signs is going to be a complete list of the names. I'm waiting to put the order in until we are certain that we have exhausted our options of finding the names, because the last thing I'd want is to order the sign and then find more names.
Do you know if you have the name of Solon Gatewood in there at all?
Grace, do you know the name Sullen Gatewood?
S-O-L-O-N?
S-O-L-O-N Gatewood?
Yes, I do believe we have that name. I'm not sure if it was on the list that is in this PowerPoint, because we have found a few names, or at least I found a few names very recently, but yes, that is one of the names on the list.
It's kind of detective work. You're always just trying to find new sources. Sometimes there's burial records, there's mortuary records, so there's all sorts of places you can check. So it's a bit like detective work, always finding something. there any more questions? Yeah.
This is more for you. You say that Eudora's black population was 25%. Was that in 1867 or was that in 1920?
In the 1870 census, which I've manually gone through and counted because we have it, roughly 25% of people in the Eudora Township, not the city per se, but the township were black. And
what was the total population then of
It's
that?
about, of the township was probably around 1,000 or so. Yeah.
In that 1927 slide with the float, was there still a large Jewish population?
No, the Eudora's Jewish community was pretty much here at the very start. Several of the founding families were Jewish. They established the Bene Israel Cemetery. They had all pretty much left by the 1870s, I think. Asher Cohen, I believe, was the last member of the original Jewish families to live here. He died in 1890. His daughter moved to Lawrence, so I don't think there was any Jewish community here by the year 1900. Yeah.
In your research, did you contact any people in Lawrence, Kansas? Because there are some people that live here in Eudora, just like myself, that moved to Lawrence, Kansas, and I don't know if they're still alive or not, but had a lot of information about the cemetery.
Grace, have you spoken to any people about the Southwest Cemetery, not just looking at the records, but have you come across anyone with any connections to it?
So I see in the chat that there is one person who is a descendant of the Fortner and Harris families. I believe the Fortner family is in Eudora City Cemetery almost exclusively. I haven't found any Fortners in Southwest. The Harris family, I do know there are some in Southwest, so I would be very interested in talking with you about your family if you're still watching this. But I haven't been able to track down any descendants or anything. So if you are a descendant of someone in Southwest, please reach out to me. I would love to talk to you about it. But yeah, so does that answer the question?
I'll see if I can get in touch with some of the families in Lawrence to see if I can get some information for you.
That would be wonderful. Yeah, I'd be happy to facilitate the two of you to talk to each other.
And what information,
Yeah, question?
Doing your research, were you able to determine like how many of them were probably may have served in the military, whether in Civil War, World War I, or World War II? Were you able to determine how many military?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Was that a question about the military?
Yeah,
How
did
many
you
are-
found out how many of them served in the military, the burials?
Yeah, so actually, when we were out there collecting geophysics data, it was Memorial Day weekend, and there were some veterans who came and placed flags on, I think, 3 of the graves. So we know it for sure, at least 3 were in, I believe it was World War I. They were all in World War I. I haven't been able to find any beyond those 3. It might be 4. I don't remember off the top of my head, but there are a few who have military service. But yeah, so that's pretty cool. They're still putting flags out there even today, or a few months ago.
Yeah, Marty?
So is this still a viable cemetery for burial?
You'd have to ask the city about that. They haven't had any burials there, as far as I'm concerned, since 1980. So I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I don't think so, but I don't know for sure. John, do you have a question?
what information does Watkins may have on Southwest?
Grace, have you looked at the Watkins Museum in Lawrence about Southwest?
Yeah, they have an entire drawer of Douglas County cemeteries that I got to look through. And unfortunately, most of their information about Southwest is things that the Eudora Area Historical Society already had. So I couldn't find any new information from them.
It's
not surprising. We have more about Eudora than the Watkins Museum, but there could be clues out there anytime, so.
Yeah, actually, if you're interested in doing a little bit of independent research about Southwest, the University of Kansas Spencer Research Library had a lot of information. They have all of the Douglas County burial records. They even have some of the original records from the city of Eudora. They're all in German, so if you can read German, that's great. But I can't read German, so I couldn't read them.
Any more questions? All right, well, thank you, Grace.